Tonight, we are going to stay very close to home, closer than a room. Everything in this episode is either on you right now or within reach of your hand. The glasses, the keys, the coins, the pen, the small flat card, the watch on your wrist. Things you pick up without looking, put in a pocket, and carry around all day without a single thought about where they came from. None of them arrived in the shape you know. That is the thread through all 14. The glasses had no arms for 400 years. The pencil has never had any lead in it. The match would only light on the floor. The wristwatch was jewelry, and a man wearing one was laughed at. The pen was too expensive to own, and then too cheap to keep. These are quiet stories. Nobody in them is famous. Several of the people sold their invention for almost nothing and went back to work the next morning. We go in order, from 1286 to 1960. Where the record is thin or disputed, I will say so at the time rather than smooth it over. There is nothing to follow here and nothing to remember. If you are here to fall asleep, that is exactly what this is for. Glasses had no arms for 400 years. Somebody in northern Italy, in the 17 years before 1286, put 2 ground lenses in a frame and held them up to a pair of eyes. We do not know who. There is no patent, no drawing, no letter. The date comes from a sermon given 20 years later, in Florence, in which a friar tells the room that the art of making spectacles is not yet 20 years old, and that he has met the man who did it. He does not give the name. That is the whole record. What they made were reading lenses for old eyes, held in a rivet frame, like a pair of scissors, pinched onto the nose or simply held up. They stayed that way for a very long time. People tied them on with ribbon over the ears. They hooked them onto hat brims. They weighted them with cords and small lead balls behind the head. Portraits of scholars show men holding their glasses in one hand while they read, because that was the only way to keep them steady. The 2 arms that go over your ears arrived in London around 1727 from an optician who advertised them as temple spectacles. 440 years after the lenses. The hard part was never the glass. The hard part was working out how to leave your hands free. There has never been any lead in a pencil. In a valley in the north of England, a storm brought down a tree, and under the roots was a seam of soft black rock. The usual date given is 1564. It was graphite, though nobody used that word for another 200 years. It was pure, and there has never been another deposit like it anywhere. Shepherds found the first use for it. It marked sheep, and the mark stayed on wool in the rain. They thought it was a kind of lead. Everything soft, gray, and heavy was a kind of lead in the 16th century. It was called black lead or plumbago, and that name is the only reason we still say the word today. There is no lead in a pencil, there never was, and there is nothing in one that can poison you. The sticks were cut into rods, wrapped in string, then in sheepskin, and later set into a groove in a piece of wood. The mine was so valuable it was guarded, flooded on purpose between diggings, and worked only a few weeks a year. The pencil you can buy now exists because that seam ran out. In 1795, a French officer named Conté ground poor graphite into powder, mixed it with clay, and baked it. More clay made a harder line. That is the whole reason your pencil has a letter and a number on the side. The ridges on a coin were put there to catch thieves. Pick up a coin and run a thumbnail around the edge. On most of them, you will feel fine ridges. They are there because of a crime that almost broke England. When coins were silver and cut by hand, no two were the same size, and the edges were rough, so people clipped them. A sliver off the rim of every coin that passed through your hands, kept in a jar, melted down at the end of the month, each coin still spent. By the 1690s, the silver money of the country was so thin and light that shopkeepers weighed it instead of counting it and refused it. The answer was mechanical. Coins struck by machine came out perfectly round, and a second machine cut grooves into the edge. A clipped coin now announced itself. The grooves were gone. In 1696, the whole silver coinage was called in and struck again, and the man given the job of running it was Isaac Newton, who left Cambridge for the mint and did not go back. He spent years on it, and a good part of that time in taverns and prisons, gathering evidence against forgers himself. The ridges outlived the reason for them. There is no silver in your change, and nothing to clip. They stayed because machines and fingers both find them useful. A blind hand can tell one coin from another by the edge alone. The umbrella was for the sun, not for the rain. The umbrella is thousands of years old, and for almost all of that time it had nothing to do with rain. It was shade. In Egypt, in Assyria, in India, a servant held it over somebody important, and it meant exactly what it looked like. This person is not standing in the sun like the rest of you. China made the change. Oiled paper on bamboo ribs sheds water, and there are Chinese rain umbrellas well over 1,000 years old. In Europe it stayed a sunshade, and a woman's one. A gentleman caught in rain took a carriage. That was the point of having money. The man usually credited with breaking this in London is Jonas Hanway, who from about 1750 walked out under one whenever it rained for 30 years and was shouted at for it. The accounts of that come later and are probably tidied up. What is certain is the reason for the hostility. Coachmen made their living from rain. A man walking under an umbrella was a affair that did not happen, and they made their feelings known from the box. It took another century to become ordinary, and one more invention. The ribs were whalebone and cane, and they were heavy. A steel rib, folded into a U shape so it flexes and springs back, came from Sheffield in 1852. That is the umbrella you own. Shoes were made with no left and no right. For most of the last 1,000 years, a pair of shoes was two identical shoes. The same shape, cut on the same wooden last, and it was up to your feet to sort it out over the first few months. They were called straights. You were told to swap them from foot to foot regularly so that they wore evenly, which tells you how little either of them fitted. This was not because nobody had thought of it. Roman military sandals were shaped left and right, and so was older footwear before that. The knowledge was simply lost when the trade changed, and what replaced it was faster to make. One last, one shape, one size in a batch. A shoemaker with half the number of wooden forms can carry half as much and charge less. The usual date given for the change is 1818 in Philadelphia, where a shoemaker began cutting and selling shoes shaped to each foot. It was not an overnight matter. Straights were still sold for decades after, mostly because they were cheaper, and armies bought them by the 100,000. What settled it was machinery. Once lasting was done by machine, in the 1860s, cutting two shapes cost no more than cutting one, and the straight shoe had no argument left. Your shoes are shaped to your feet because it stopped costing anything. The first match was found on the end of a stirring stick. Before matches, lighting a fire took a tinderbox, a flint, a steel, and a good deal of patience. Households kept a fire alive all winter rather than face starting one. In 1826, a chemist in the north of England named John Walker was mixing a paste in his shop. Some of it dried on the end of the stick he had been stirring with. He scraped the stick on the stone floor to clean it, and it caught. He sold them from the shop within the year, in tin tubes with a folded strip of sandpaper, under the name friction lights. They were long, they smelled, and they sometimes threw sparks across the room. He never patented them. When he was urged to, he said the thing was too useful to be owned, which cost him everything, and is the only reason his name is remembered kindly. The match you have now works the other way round. The dangerous ingredient was taken out of the head and moved onto the side of the box, which is why a modern match will not light on a wall, a boot, or a floor. That change was made in Sweden in the 1850s, and it is why a box of matches is sold as a box rather than as matches. 200 years on, it is still the cheapest manufactured object most people own. The safety pin was invented in 3 hours to pay off a debt. Walter Hunt was a mechanic in New York who invented constantly and kept none of it. A sewing machine, a fountain pen, a knife sharpener, a machine for making nails. He would solve a problem, lose interest, and sell the paper. In 1849, he owed a man $15. The story, which is well documented and has stayed consistent, is that he sat down with a piece of brass wire about 8 inches long and worked on it for 3 hours. What he made was one piece of wire with 3 jobs in it: a coil at one end, which acts as a spring and holds the pin open, a point, and a cap that covers the point when it is closed, so it cannot come undone in cloth and cannot stick you. Pins had existed for thousands of years. None of them had the guard, and none of them had the spring. He patented it in April and sold the rights outright for $400. He paid the $15 and kept the rest. The men who bought it made a fortune. It is worth looking at one for a moment. It is the same wire, bent the same way, still made in one operation. In 175 years, nobody has found anything to improve, and it is difficult to think of another object that can be said about. Your house key is a 4,000-year-old idea. Inside your lock there is a row of small pins. Each one is cut in 2 places. When the wrong key goes in, the cuts sit at the wrong heights, and the barrel will not turn. When the right key goes in, every cut lines up along one thin gap, and the whole thing turns freely. That idea is about 4,000 years old. Egyptian locks worked on exactly the same principle, in wood, with pegs that dropped into holes and a large wooden key that lifted them clear. Some of them were as long as a forearm. Everything since has been the same thought made smaller and in metal. Roman locks were bronze and small enough to wear as a ring. Medieval European locks went the other way and became enormous, ornamented, and mostly defeated by brute force. The key you carry comes from 1861 from a father and son in America, both named Linus Yale. The son took the old pin idea, shrank it, put the pins in a cylinder, and cut the key as a flat-notched blade instead of a solid shaft. That is the whole invention. A lock the size of a walnut, and a key that weighs nothing and lies flat in a pocket. Every door you unlock today used a Bronze Age idea that somebody finally made small. The first plastic was made to replace elephant ivory. The first plastic anybody could buy was not made to be modern. It was made because a raw material was running short. Ivory was used for combs, buttons, piano keys, knife handles, and billiard balls, and by the 1860s it was expensive and getting scarcer. A printer in New York named John Wesley Hyatt spent years looking for a substitute, and in 1869 he found one by mixing cellulose from cotton with camphor. Heated, it could be pressed into any shape. Cooled, it held it. He called it celluloid. The famous part of this story is a $10,000 prize offered by a billiard company for a replacement ball. The prize is repeated everywhere. No evidence has ever turned up that it was offered or paid, and Hyatt's own accounts do not mention collecting it. Treat it as a story attached to a real invention. Billiard balls were never the point anyway. Combs were. Celluloid combs, made by the million, were the first plastic object ordinary people owned and carried, and they were sold precisely because they looked like something rich people had. The material is nearly gone now. It burns too easily, and better plastics replaced it. It survives in table tennis balls, guitar picks, and the odd fountain pen. The Army never carried the Swiss Army knife. In 1891, the Swiss Army bought a folding knife for its soldiers. A blade, a screwdriver, a reamer, and a tin opener in a dark wooden handle. Practical, heavy, and made in Germany, because no Swiss workshop could produce them at that price. A cutler named Karl Elsener took that personally. He organized the Swiss knife makers into an association and won the contract back at a loss he carried for years. Then, in 1897, he patented a different knife, lighter, with a second smaller blade, a corkscrew, and springs on both sides of the handle so that tools could be fitted, facing both ways. He called it the officer's knife. The Army never adopted it. It was never issued to anybody. It was sold in shops to civilians. And it is the knife the whole world now pictures. The name people use came later still, from American soldiers stationed in Europe after the Second War, who bought them in canteens and could not pronounce the German word for officer's knife. Elsener named the company after his mother, Victoria, and added the word for stainless steel when it arrived, Victorinox. The red handle and the white cross were chosen so that a dropped knife could be found in snow or in a dark pack. The wristwatch was a woman's bracelet until a war. For 400 years, a watch was something a man kept in a pocket, on a chain, and took out. Small watches worn on the wrist existed, but they were made as jewelry for women, set in a bracelet with stones around the face. The first one on record was made in 1810 for the Queen of Naples. A man wearing one was a joke, and the joke had a phrase attached to it. It was said that a man would sooner wear a skirt than a wristwatch. That was the state of things in 1900. What changed it was work that needed both hands and exact timing at the same moment. Officers in colonial campaigns had already begun strapping small watches to their wrists with leather cups, because a pocket watch cannot be consulted while riding, signaling, or holding anything. By the First War, it had stopped being optional. Artillery fired to the minute in coordination with men moving forward, and a soldier could not stop to dig in a pocket. Watch companies sold trench watches by the 100,000, with metal grills over the glass and luminous dials. The men came home wearing them, and the joke was over. Within 10 years, wristwatches outsold pocket watches many times over. The pocket watch never came back. The wrist is simply a better place for it. Sunglasses were first worn to hide the eyes. Dark glasses are older than sun protection, and the first use we have any record of has nothing to do with brightness. In Chinese courts, judges are described as wearing flat panels of smoked quartz over their eyes, not to see better, so that nobody in the room could read their reaction to a witness. The accounts of this are old and thin, and they are repeated far more confidently than the evidence supports, so treated as reported rather than settled. For centuries after that, tinted lenses were medical. Blue and green glass was prescribed for particular complaints of the eye, and nobody wore them outdoors for comfort. The ordinary sunglasses in your pocket start in 1929 on a boardwalk in New Jersey, where a man named Sam Foster sold cheap molded frames with tinted lenses to people on the beach who simply wanted to sit in the sun without squinting. They sold as fast as he could put them out. Everything after that is refinement. A polarizing filter that cuts the glare coming off water and roads was made practical in 1936. Pilots got a large teardrop lens the year after to cut the light at altitude. The judges had the right idea, though. A great deal of what sunglasses do now is still about not being read. The pen that only worked in the air. A fountain pen leaks when the air pressure drops. Every pilot in the 1930s knew it, and so did anybody who had carried one up a mountain. A Hungarian newspaper editor named Laszlo Biro was watching newspaper ink dry on the press, almost instantly, and wondered why pens could not use it. The answer is that thick ink will not run down a nib. So with his brother, a chemist, he put a tiny ball in the tip. The ball rolls, picks up ink from above, and lays it down. Gravity does the work, and a sealed tube does not care what the air outside it is doing. The first serious customer was an Air Force. The pens were licensed to be made for aircrew, who could write at altitude without a shower of ink over the charts. Then it went wrong. In 1945, a businessman in New York rushed a copy to market at $12.50, about a week's wages, and sold 10,000 on the first day. They blotted, they clogged, and they came back by the sackful. Within 3 years, the ballpoint had a reputation as a fraud, and sales collapsed. It was saved by a Frenchman named Marcel Biche, who bought the patent, spent years on the precision of the ball, and sold the pen for the price of a newspaper. The stripe on your card was stuck on with a clothes iron. The card in your wallet has 2 separate inventions in it, and the second one was solved on an ironing board. The first is the card itself. A dining club in New York issued one in 1950 on cardboard to a few hundred members who could use it in a couple of dozen restaurants. The story usually told is that the founder had been caught in a restaurant without his wallet and thought of it there. His own daughter said many years later that this was a sales story, and it has been repeated for 70 years anyway. Plastic came at the end of that decade. The second is the stripe. A card that a machine can read has to carry the number in a form a machine can pick up, and magnetic tape already did that perfectly well. The problem was attaching a short piece of tape to a plastic card without wrecking either. Glue smeared the tape. Heat warped the card. By the account IBM has told about its own engineer, Forrest Perry came home with the pieces in his pocket, and his wife Dorothea was ironing. She suggested the iron. The heat was even, brief and gentle enough, and the tape sat down onto the plastic and stayed. Everything you tap or swipe descends from a domestic iron on a board in a house in California. That is 14 of them. There is one thing worth saying before you go. Almost nobody in this episode got rich. Walter Hunt sold the safety pin for $400 to pay a debt of $15. John Walker refused to patent the match at all and said it was too useful to own. The man who first put lenses in front of somebody's eyes is not even a name. Jonas Hanway was shouted at in the street for 30 years for carrying an umbrella and did not live to see everybody carrying one. The objects went on without them. Every one of these things reached its final shape and then simply stopped changing, sometimes for centuries. The safety pin has not been improved since 1849. The pin tumbler in your lock is 4,000 years old. The pencil has been a graphite and clay rod in a wooden groove since 1795. You are carrying a small museum, and none of it looks old, because a thing that is finished stops looking like anything at all. Sleep well.